Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by David Epstein. David is the author of the forthcoming book, Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and of the top 10 New York Times bestseller, The Sports Gene, which has been published in 21 languages. To his surprise, it was purchased not only by his sister, but also by President Barack Obama and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He was previously a science and investigative reporter at ProPublica, and prior to that, a senior writer at Sports Illustrated. David has given talks about performance science and the uses and misuses of data on 5 continents. His TED Talk has been viewed 7 million times and was shared by Bill Gates. 3 of his stories have been optioned for films. David has a master's degree in environmental science and journalism, and is reasonably sure he's the only person to have co-authored a paper in the Journal of Arctic, Antarctic, and Alpine Research while a writer at Sports Illustrated. David enjoys volunteering with the Pat Tillman Foundation and Classroom Champions. An avid runner, he was a Columbia University record holder and twice NCAA All-East as an 800-meter runner. David was the first guest to appear on this podcast, and his book, The Sports Gene, inspired me to think more deeply about the relationship between nature and nurture and all the variables that influence performance. We live in the age of hacking, competition for attention on social media, and overhyped, bastardized science. David's writing provided depth where superficiality was otherwise so pervasive. The Sports Gene is a misnomer, as the book is really about complexity and the various micro and macro level biological and sociocultural influences on performance. Like other guests on the podcast here, David is basically obsessed with trying to reconcile the small and the large world as they pertain to outcomes and the things we really care about. His most recent book, Range, explores the relationship between connectivity, insight, and innovation. High performers, David argues, are not always those who spend their lives zooming in on a particular discipline, but those who recognize the arbitrary boundaries between various ideological models. Range speaks to many of the themes explored by this season's guests thus far. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests. Here's David Epstein. David, thanks so much for coming on. So you're actually the first person that I ever interviewed for this podcast, and at that time we talked about your book, The Sports Gene, which, as we discussed, was kind of a misnomer because it wasn't really about genetics and sports specifically, but more about all of the variables that influence athletic performance, kind of nature, nurture debate. And even the nurture discussion you had was really, micro level as far as like different training environments, and then macro level as far as some of the social and cultural things that can influence performance. So it's really a book about complexity, and you've completed a book recently called Range that's going to be released pretty soon, which is really kind of warns us about the perils of specialization. So what was the impetus for writing Range? I saw it kind of as a natural extension of Sports Gene, but from your standpoint, what made you interested in that topic of specialists versus generalists?
I mean, in some ways, it definitely was an extension because actually, when I sort of reverse engineer the idea, I mean, after the Sports Gene came out, I was invited to have sort of a debate with Malcolm Gladwell at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference in 2014. And that was the first time we ever met. And it was framed as this debate like 10,000 hours versus the Sports Gene, even though, we're not in direct conflict as much as I guess it was framed. But definitely some conflict. And I figured one of the things that Malcolm would argue, because it's like a corollary of what he was writing, is that a head start in deliberate practice, or basically highly technical practice, is kind of an insurmountable advantage and an incredibly important thing to do if you want to become an expert in anything. And in preparation for that debate, I sort of looked at data, longitudinal data where I could find it about athletes who go on to become elite, and found that the trend, that people became experts by an incredible, varied array of paths, but that the norm was actually doing a wide array of things, like learning sort of general skills early, going through what scientists call a sampling period, where you try a bunch of stuff out, figure out what you're good at and what you like, and delaying specialization and technical practice longer than their peers who plateaued at lower levels. And so I sort of discussed some of that data. And when we're coming off the stage, he kind of said, what you got me on was that Roger versus Tiger thing. Because I had framed it as Roger Federer's developmental path, where he did a whole bunch of stuff early and his mother wouldn't allow him to specialize, as more the norm, and the Tiger Woods path of early specialization is much more the exception. And I just sort of filed that away in my head and didn't really think about it that much until, honestly, the next year I started getting involved with the Pat Tillman Foundation. One of the guys I ran track with in college was a Tillman scholar. So the foundation, of course, in the name of the former NFL player who died in Afghanistan, provides scholarships and funding for career development and going back to school for veterans and soldiers and military spouses. And I gave a talk to like a tiny group, maybe like 15 Tillman scholars, about some of this specialization data in sports, and just prepping for it, since it wasn't a sports audience, I looked at research, just a little bit of outside research at career selection and tossed that in, maybe like 3 minutes of the talk. And afterward, almost every single one of them came up to me and was like, I'm so relieved to hear that like it's not over for me, even though I'm behind my peers going to grad school or whatever career they're in. And this was crazy. I mean, it was like, I remember one specific, a Navy SEAL who was going to grad school at both Dartmouth and Harvard at the same time, sent me this note saying how relieved he was, that he didn't have to feel behind and like he could never catch up. And I sort of started to think, gosh, this is really crazy that people are made to feel this way. I wonder if there's analogous research in fields outside of sports that show the same sort of pattern, where the norm of people who get to the top is actually breadth early and delaying specialization. So I sort of, what Malcolm said came back to my head then, and I decided to explore if there was a larger project.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I want to get more into your own personal experiences later, but I could see how that Tillman Scholarship experience resonated with you because, you haven't had a totally linear career path. I could see how you hit it off with some of those Tillman scholars. But one of the things that I really enjoy about the book is that you kind of like the themes are explored through stories. So you don't really tell people what to think. You tell some of these stories and then the themes become sort of apparent. So you open up the book, like you alluded to a second ago, talking about the difference between Tiger Woods and Roger Federer and how that comparison sort of serves as a metaphor for the relationship between complicated and complex systems. So can you talk about where that analogy, the Roger Federer, Tiger Woods analogy, works and where it fails in terms of the specialization discussion? Because one of the things you also talk about is how some of the, in real life, so to speak, some of the sports where we're trying to solve problems, we don't even know what the sport is. You talk about how real life and solving some of these complex problems is what you would call Martian tennis, where it somewhat resembles something that we're familiar with, but it's a totally different sport that we haven't exactly seen. So can you talk a little bit more about that Tiger Woods and Roger Federer analogy?
Yeah, and I should say that Martian tennis is coined by psychologist Robin Hogarth, but that analogy, so part of the argument I make early in the book is that books sort of in the performance books, I guess in the area where I read, I would say Tiger Woods is probably the single most prominent example of how to become successful in something. And I think I can think of off the top of my head at least a half dozen bestsellers that his story has been at the core of. And one of the arguments I make is that we shouldn't be extrapolating from Tiger Woods to everything else in the world, because golf is actually, in many cases, a pretty bad model of most of the things people want to learn. So it's non-dynamic, right? It's much more like what I would call an industrial task, where you want to repeat essentially known perfect movements over and over with as little deviation as possible. And so that kind of task is much more amenable to a specialization approach, but that's not what most of the world is, right? So when I contrast it to Roger in tennis, right, that's much more dynamic. You have to use what sports psychologists call anticipatory skill, which means the game is unfolding too fast for our biology really to track it, right? Like the advice that you give people, say in baseball more often than tennis, of course, to keep your eye on the ball is actually literally impossible. We don't have a visual system capable of tracking an object as its angular position is changing that quickly as it comes at us. So you have to be able to judge based on body movements of opponents and spin of the ball and things like that, what's coming in the future. And that is a much different skill than the sort of repetitive motion with as little deviation as possible. That said, so it's a much more dynamic skill, and there's more evidence that diversification is helpful with it. That said, like you mentioned, I think most of the things that are difficult to learn are more like what Robin Hogarth, this psychologist, called Martian tennis. And what Hogarth did is he divided up task domains into a spectrum he called kind versus wicked, right? And so kind would be something really like golf, where every time you do something, you have feedback that is both 100% accurate and instant. So like you hit the ball, you see where it flies immediately, you can adjust right away. In something that's totally on the other end of the spectrum, one of the most wicked environments he identifies is like where you get feedback that's either delayed, incomplete, or the very worst is if it reinforces the wrong lesson. And he uses this example of a famous medical diagnostician who was renowned for being able to diagnose typhoid like weeks before a patient showed any symptoms. And the doctor would palpate their tongue. He would use his hands to touch patient's tongue and say, this person's going to get typhoid, in a couple of weeks, and was right over and over and over again, and became famous for that. And as one of his colleagues later said, he was a more prolific carrier of typhoid than Typhoid Mary, because in fact he was transferring typhoid using his hands on people's tongues. And so he was the exact wrong message was reinforced. So I think one place the overall analogy breaks down is really that sports overall, while tennis is more toward the wicked end of the spectrum than golf, where the feedback is not quite as instant, not a lot more varied, not always as easily interpretable, it's still way on the kind end of the spectrum compared to, say, working in an emergency room where you might have to deal with something quickly and never know what happens after that. So you might have to find ways other than direct experience of learning. And so even though I contrast Roger and Tiger early on and say the Roger method of sort of breadth first and delaying specialization is the more common route to mastering complex skills, there's a point where I almost undermine that a little and say, but actually we shouldn't be extrapolating from sports to most things at all, because they are relatively kind learning environments where feedback is quick and accurate, and that's not the case for more complex work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's basically like all these different dynamic tasks exist on a spectrum, and you talk about the wicked versus predictable distinction. So the natural question from there sort of is, how do learning environments develop our ability to adapt to these wicked environments? So you talk a lot in the book about the survival value of pattern recognition and how we need repetition and to see the same things repeatedly because that has survival value. But your book isn't about just surviving. It's about sort of creative endeavors and innovation and the ability to connect. So how do some of the different learning environments, be they the wicked or predictable environments, influence our ability to recognize some of these patterns, but at the same time develop the ability to adapt and improvise? And you mentioned in the book too that there's short and long-term benefits of both approaches, which I think also speaks to the more macro level topic of there's short and long-term benefits to a specialized versus a generalized approach. Yep. So how do these different learning environments play into that wicked versus predictable distinction that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I should say, I should have clarified my last answer when we mentioned Martian tennis. What Robin Hogarth uses Martian tennis to mean is he says, in a lot of the world, in most complex endeavors, not only are you playing something more complicated than tennis, you're playing Martian tennis, by which he means you've arrived at a game, you don't know how it works, nobody tells you the rules, you just have to infer them from watching, and they can change without notice, basically. Yeah. And so that's sort of what he uses Martian tennis as a stand-in for that. But like you said, these wicked versus predictable or kind, as he calls them, learning environments. So in a kind learning environment, if you're going to, a kind learning environment would be something, again, where most or all of the information is available. Like you can see everything, right? You can think of chess or golf or whatever it is. When you do something, the consequences are readily apparent, and those consequences give you very accurate feedback. And if an environment is structured that way, then pattern recognition is incredibly useful, right? Because basically what you're doing is internalizing the types of patterns that will allow you to have intuition that's accurate and much more accurate than someone could have just by trying to kind of like logically analyze the situation. So the gut feelings of, surgeons and pilots and things like that, they can develop remarkable intuition if they're in an environment with certain regularities. The trouble is when the environment is less regular, right? Like when something less expected happens. So in a later part of the book than we're talking about, I looked through research on commercial air disasters. And in almost all cases, not every case, but almost all cases, what happens is that a crew with like a really great flight safety record finds himself in a situation where there are all these signals saying something is different, something unusual is going on, and instead they continue to stick to a pattern they've seen before and be anchored to the initial goal and sort of deny that anything is different until it's basically too late to do anything about it. So I think the short-term benefits of training in a kind learning environment are that for very expected situations, you'll become quite good at them. The problem is you become very limited when something is sort of outside that scope. And so we know even in, if you're training, like one of the examples I used was research on training people in simulations for naval threats. And if you give one group of people the same threat to respond to over and over and over and over again, they'll get way, way better really quickly that day on that threat. And other people, you give them all these varied challenges and they feel really frustrated and they feel like they didn't learn anything on that day. And then if you bring them back a month later with no training between, the people who had much more varied training will be far better at dealing with any challenge that they haven't seen before than the people who sort of mastered the one. So they've maybe mastered that one, but unless that's exactly the thing they're going to face again, it can be very limiting.
Yeah, and you also, you talk a lot about educational policy in general and even what's going on at certain schools with some of the more innovative learning models. And you compare the more immersive learning environments where you talk about how, like Martian Tennis, no one actually tells you the rules. So when we learn to speak as children, no one tells us the rules. We just kind of observe. We're in this immersive environment, and we somehow learn the rules of language without explicitly being told what they are. And then we can compare that to the more reverse engineering model of learning, like we get in learning a foreign language in school, where we learn grammatical rules. We're told, here's how to conjugate these different verbs. And clearly one works better than the other because it's much more difficult to learn a foreign language in middle school than it is to soak it in when you're young and you're immersed in that environment. There's also certain constraints in the educational system that aren't conducive to having that more immersive learning environment. So, what do you think? I know this is a very loaded question. Is the low-hanging fruit in the educational system as far as how can we create more or less predictable learning environments and create more adaptable thinkers while also respecting some of the political and logistical constraints?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, someone could make the argument that, well, the reason that immersive learning of language works is because your brain is different when you're really young. Right, but the fact is, it doesn't work as fast for adults, but it still works a lot better for adults. In fact, after doing some of this research, I'm in a bilingual school district, so have started taking some Spanish lessons through an app and picked one on purpose because it takes sort of the whole language first approach where you're thrown in and kind of immersed in conversations, and it feels like really, really frustrating. And I had taken Spanish in school for a bunch of years and know basically nothing, despite having taken it for a number of years in school. I couldn't even have a basic conversation. And I probably learned more in like the last 2 months using this like immersion app than I did, in years of school. And the getting thrown in and you sort of have to deduce the rules intuitively is a totally different experience. It's way more frustrating. You're for sure going to rate yourself as having learned less after any particular situation. But then when you're tossed into an unfamiliar situation, it's almost like feels a little magical, like you can start using things that you didn't really expect. So I had been trained in Spanish before and learning how to conjugate all the verbs and things like that. Now I'm not learning that at all. I'm learning it the way I learned English. Okay, so I'm a professional writer, obviously. I know like zip about formal grammar. I guess I don't know. I didn't have like a very good middle school or whatever, I guess, and I don't remember spending a day learning formal grammar in school. And so I still don't know what formal grammar rules are, and yet I can kind of mainly follow them and express myself well because of the way I learned language. And so I think even with the constraints of the classroom and the limited time period, you can't get as much practice in, but I still think that you can employ some of what we know are the best practices. And some of those are variable training, right? Like you want to mix and match, or what scientists call interleaving, where instead of doing the same thing over and over and over, you want to mix all the tasks together. So if you're trying to study, one of the examples I use is, let's say you were trying to study artists, and you have a bunch of flashcards of Picasso and a bunch of flashcards of Monet and a bunch of flashcards of Van Gogh. Instead of looking at all the Picassos and all the Monets and all the Van Goghs, what you want to do is shuffle them all up and then quiz yourself with them all mixed up. And you'll do worse that day, but you'll start to form general abstract rules about what are the signatures of those artists' styles that will allow you to do a much better job of picking them out if you're faced with works that you've never seen before. So it's really about trying to build these sort of general models, that these abstractions in your brain that make you adaptable to what's coming next. And the worst way to set that up is by starting with like the most formal type of training, where you start by adhering to procedures as opposed to building these more general mental structures.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a great analogy, but I just think of now with GPS and driving, like there are times when I travel and I might have to go to the same place every day for a week, and I'm always using a GPS. And at the end of the week, I might be like, you know what, I want to see if I can get to this place without a GPS. And because the GPS is effectively telling me the rules, I don't retain that sense of direction at all. And unless I've like struggled a little bit and had to sort of internalize the rules myself, I don't retain any information. So I could literally drive the same route every day for a week sometimes. And even if it's a pretty simple route, and sometimes I can't, if I try to cut myself off the GPS, because I never forced myself to actually think and retain it, I need to rely on the GPS even when I try to cut myself off. So it's really interesting how a little bit of struggle, and there's a difference between being told the rules and having to discover them from a retention standpoint.
That's a great point. That's a great way to put it, right? So when you follow the GPS, you get into, what like a psychologist would call using procedures mode. Basically, you're following these procedures, and even if you do them over and over and over and over again, you don't create sort of more stable mental model of what's actually going on in the larger context of your knowledge. You're just using this procedure over and over and over again. And if something changes, like if you did end up taking a wrong turn, even though you've gone that route many, many times, you'd probably be in trouble because it's not built into sort of the larger semantic network of your brain. And there's some really interesting work on that in taxi drivers in London. When they were given GPS, it really changed. It really even changed like anatomically parts of their brain where they didn't have to kind of embed directions in this larger network of knowledge in their brain. So it becomes this totally isolated thing. And if anything unexpected happens, you're kind of in trouble with that. And that also gets to another thing I write about in the book called the generation effect, which is you definitely want to make it hard on yourself when you're learning by forcing yourself to generate the answers instead of just studying them, which is effectively what following GPS is, where like you're told the answer, you follow the answer over and over again. But because you weren't forced to generate it, you're better off getting it wrong, but being forced to try to generate the answer yourself, because in the long term, that's how you prime your brain to then learn it better, by being forced to attempt to generate it as opposed to just studying it or repeating it.
Yeah, and I mean, really, your book Range is ultimately about critical thinking, which is obviously a very abstract topic. And there's a point in the book where you discuss this interaction between some psychology researchers and a group of farmers that were pretty much cut off from the modern world. And in the book, the farmers are portrayed as somewhat myopic because when they were tested by the psychologist, they were deemed to lack these abstract critical thinking skills. And so you make the point in the book that modern humans are what you call abstract generalists and the farmers are not. And my counterpoint to that would be, that the farmers are actually functional generalists relative to the modern humans from the standpoint that the farmers are more doers than thinkers, because that's sort of what their environment incentivizes them to do. So these farmers presumably are, procuring their own food, building their own shelters. They've got to worry about predators, sort of a more, the word primitive can be pejorative, but I don't mean it in a pejorative way, but they didn't have the luxury of some of these abstract thinking skills.
Yeah.
And because there's really no survival value to having that. Whereas, I would say that most modern humans, at least in the Western world, are what you could call functional specialists, where we pretty much do the same job every day. We live very repetitive lives, but we might have more variety from an abstract thinking standpoint. So while I appreciate critical thinking as a discipline, I think it's problematic when somebody anoints him or herself as the arbiter of critical thinking. Like, if I created a test of critical thinking and then I tested other people in that domain, it seems kind of self-righteous, because I'm basically saying I define what critical thinking is. So is there even an arbiter of critical thinking, and can we even quantify something that's, it's almost antithetical to the book, where the book is about uncertainty and how certain things can't be quantified, and yet we try to quantify it. And I think that even though that's problematic, we have to at least try to do it. So where do you weigh in there?
I think that's a really good critique. And I just want to point out, I make sure to say that one style of thinking is not better than the other. Like I quote Ibn Khaldun, who a lot of people consider the father of sociology, in Arab historiographer, who noted that, if an urban person is in the desert, then a nomad who they thought was unsophisticated will seem like the biggest genius they've ever met. What I think it's really about, and what happened in this case was a group of psychologists used the creation of the Soviet Union, basically, where a whole bunch of land on which subsistence farmers lived in really remote areas was suddenly nationalized, basically, and turned into collective farming, and schools were set up and all these things. So people who had been living in one way of life, in a very isolated way of life for a long time, suddenly were kind of dragged into more modern and interconnected economies. And it sort of changed the way they think. The more exposure they had to that kind of work, the better they were on these tests of abstract thinking. And I think you're right that in many ways, they are a functional generalist and they have to do everything for themselves, right? Whereas we don't even have to think about where our food comes from. It comes from the grocery store, right? And no one, there's a pencil on my desk, and I don't know if there's like any one person in the world who knows all the steps to making a pencil even. That said, I think the most important distinction I was trying to get at was that we are better equipped for transfer on a very short time scale. So just as we would seem like idiots in the condition of those subsistence farmers, we can change jobs and domains and geography quite readily. Sometimes it even benefits us, whereas if they're made to transfer out of the domains that they're familiar to, they're basically not able to do it. So I think your critique is very well taken. It's a good one. I think what the distinction is that for us, we survive by transfer, by taking knowledge structures and applying them to things we've never seen. And I think we can actually do that a lot more adeptly than even we think, which is why people succeed sometimes by bringing knowledge that, developed knowledge just to a place that isn't using it, even if it's not new knowledge. And that we should feel like we can transfer. And we do that all the time because our environment is changing and we are capable of changing the work that we're doing. I think there's an excessive drive to make people do the same thing every day, partly because we think they should be, because we think specialization is only good. But that's the distinction I was really trying to get at, was that because we have this sort of historically unprecedented capacity for abstract knowledge structures, we can transfer knowledge to situations we've never seen before, which is a capacity that was limited for the subsistence farmers.
Yeah, I think the greater point is that human beings are very adaptable. And like what's cool is that, both groups are human, and you don't probably see that much kind of cultural and abstract thinking diversity in any other species, right?
Totally. And I mean, it's a pretty modern phenomenon. Like the context in which I talk about this is the so-called Flynn Effect, which is a political scientist, basically, James Flynn, discovered starting in the 80s. He was reading research on cognitive testing of soldiers in World War I and World War II, and noticed that on these IQ tests, and noticed that the World War II soldiers had gotten a lot more answers correct on the tests. The tests are normed so that the average score is always 100, but that the World War II soldiers had actually gotten a lot more questions right. So even if their scores are renormed, they had done better. And he decided to see if this had happened in other parts of the world. And it turns out it's basically happened all around the world, where at about 3 points per decade, like the entire curve has shifted over, and the improvement has come specifically on the stuff that is like least taught in school. It's come specifically on these abstract, like you're given a series of patterns and have to decide which one fits next, or these abstract connections between how terms are similar and stuff like that. And even if you look at the vocabulary sections of tests, the places where improvements have come are on these, not on concrete words, but on these more abstract terms like citizen and pledge and stuff like that. And so our situation that requires a lot of adaptable knowledge transfer has led to this improvement in basically all of humanity in the ability to think abstractly or to deduce rules where none are given, basically.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about some of your personal experiences exploring these concepts, because I feel like, these are things that you've grappled with in your own life, and you're very transparent about that in the book. So one of the things you talk about is how, scientific research as a field doesn't really incentivize thinking across disciplines. And I don't think that's a criticism of the scientific method per se. I think it's worthy of mention, but you talk about your own experience as a master's degree student, where you acknowledge that you basically practice science as a master's degree student without ever questioning some of the underlying statistical and conceptual assumptions that dictate those research methods. So can you talk about some, your experiences when you were a scientist, and how, you struggle with some of these themes yourself?
Yeah. And I mean, I honestly struggled with deciding whether I should write about that, because the fact is, I have one publication I know of in a scientific journal that I'm basically positive is sort of a false positive, so to speak, because I didn't know what I was doing at the time. And I don't really enjoy the fact that that's true, to be quite honest. And so what happened, I was, in grad school, in geological sciences grad school, I was living in the Arctic, studying permafrost and how it changes while temperature changes in the lower Arctic tundra. And I was learning all this like really granular information about Arctic plant physiology and all this stuff, and collecting all this data. And what I would do was then take it back, and everyone used the same kind of statistical software, and you'd go and run statistical tests on it and see if you get some significant result. And what I realized in retrospect was that I had so much data that when I was running these statistical tests, it was basically impossible that I wouldn't find significant results from all this data, because just by randomness, if you're running all these statistical tests, you're going to get some positive results. And I think that's really showing up now in what science is calling the replication crisis, right? It's turning out that all these famous studies are not replicating and were probably never true. And that's because the scientists doing them didn't really understand the statistical tests they were using and the way that they were setting up their own studies. And so when people are using sort of better methods and trying to replicate them, or just trying to replicate them not with better methods, they're not replicating. And that's because people like me, instead of learning, and I think this is partly has been really exacerbated with the rise of statistics software and computers, because you can get a giant database, right? Everyone wants big data. You get a giant database, you run sophisticated statistical software on it, and you're going to come up with positive results by chance alone. And if you don't realize if you don't understand how you set up your experiment, what it can possibly show from the way you set it up, and how those statistical tests work, you're basically always going to get some positive result if you have enough data and good stats software. And so people like me went and got all that data, and, we're happy to get these positive results. And only years later as a journalist did I start thinking about how I set up my experiments and what that statistical program was actually doing when I pressed enter, which nobody had ever stopped to talk to me about at all, or about how I set up my experiments. And then I got a master's degree from Columbia for doing that work, with 0 times had anyone ever mentioned to me how experimental methodology is supposed to work, what that statistical software is actually doing, what the dangers are when you're gathering these huge amounts of data and you're going to have positive results just by chance alone. These like incredibly most fundamental aspects of what anyone practicing science should know. Like, how can you even set up an experiment to attempt to show causality? Like, some of the stuff I set up, I couldn't show causality from the get-go because I wasn't setting the experiments up right. And it's crazy to me that as a journalist writing about, science being done not very well is when I learned that I myself had been doing science poorly because I'd been rushed into this very specialized program of learning, Arctic plant physiology and all these other very specialized things, and never taught how the fundamentals of scientific thinking is even supposed to work. And it really kind of like makes me mad. And I think it was the case for all of my peers too. And I think that's a big part of the reason of how we got to the replication crisis of today, where a huge number of famous results in science are not replicating and probably were never true because they were done not nefariously. Like, there's definitely fraud, but I think more of it is people like me who were rushed into a very specialized work without knowing the larger concepts of how science should work in order to be done well.
Yeah, and I think that to me is the most fascinating dichotomy in the book, is because the concepts that you explore, you're not just making them up. Like, they are backed up by research and more robust research, but you also acknowledge that a lot of the things that are generated in research are generated in a very constrained set of circumstances that are trying to answer a very specific question, and because of that, they're not that generalizable. So that's the thing that we all struggle with, right? Is like we need to look at objective data to substantiate our beliefs, but the manner in which this objective data is generated isn't always done in a way that's transferable to this larger world. I interviewed a sports scientist a couple weeks ago named Milan Jovanovic, and he talked about, and this to me is the fundamental question when it comes to science or even sports training, is there's the small world and the large world. And the small world is the world that you live in that deals with these very, sort of specific parameters, whether it's a randomized controlled trial or in a sports training environment where you're in practice, which you're trying to simulate the game or the larger world, but you can't always simulate game-like conditions in a practice setting, just like you can't simulate what goes on in a clinical environment in a randomized controlled trial always. But that's the thing, is like, how do we make the small world look more like the large world? And we need both. We need statistical modeling, and we need some of these micro level things to keep us in check, but at the same time, they don't always answer the question. So it's really difficult, right?
Totally. And I mean, I think it gets, is related to this point of, we all need to make sense of things. I guess we don't need to, but would benefit from trying to update our mental models constantly, using personal experience, using subjective data, using, randomized controlled trials, if we have access to those. And how do you take all this information from all these different levels of evidence on board and update your mental models? And to me, what I think is some of the fundamental components of scientific thinking are so helpful, like the approach to new information are so helpful for navigating the world in general, never mind science. Like, science is a, thing that a much smaller number of people are doing. But the fact that those are, like, to me, some of the most important tools for thinking in the modern world, and even the scientists aren't being made to learn them, is just like tragic.
Yeah, and so there's this idea that we have like these small world methods that can sort of explain reality, and sort of segueing into your own career path, there's this expectation that as modern humans, we're supposed to have this kind of very linear and scripted career path. And one of the things that you talk about is how you struggled with this, reconciling this grit, never quit mindset that's so pervasive in our society, with also recognizing when it's time to give up and try something new. And clearly, you're not a scientist now, because we're talking about a book you just wrote that's written for the general population. So now you're an author who explores these broad topics. So why do you think it is that we have this expectation of having this very linear, predefined career path, when clearly that's something that you didn't do yourself? And I think that it's worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a couple things there that I'm interested in, and one of which, so you mentioned grit, right, which is an incredibly popular psychological construct that's basically a combination of um, resilience and your capacity to just stick with something that you engage in, right? And when you mentioned that I suggest it's limited in some ways, I think it's a really interesting construct and it appeals to me incredibly. At the same time, it scores you more highly if you don't change your interests often. And one of the ways where you talk about like the small world, right, is the most famous studies of grit that show its impact are on populations of people who are already in an extremely constrained situation. Like they are in the national finals of the spelling bee, or they are in the orientation period at West Point or something like that. So the range of the world has been restricted down to these incredibly narrow circumstances where you can see why something like not changing your interests at that point will lead to the outcome that you want or that the institution wants. Whereas if you zoom out and look at the much larger world, I argue in the book that there's a lot of evidence that changing your interests in response to information about yourself, about your own skills, and about the world is actually a much more. I didn't frame it in that small world, large world way that you did, but I think that's a good way to think of it, right? Like when you've zoomed in far enough that people are just trying to succeed at a very well-defined task, then you don't want their interest to change while they're pursuing that task. But if you zoom out and ask about how do they maximize what economists call match quality, right? The fit between who they are and what they do, then the answer is actually by trying a whole bunch of different stuff, getting information signals, incorporating that into what they think about their own interests and abilities, and then changing course constantly and going forward until they sort of triangulate the best place for themselves. And that's exactly, in retrospect, feels incredibly resonant with what I did in my own career. When I was like 16, I was positive I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. And I wanted to be like a test pilot, an astronaut. I'm positive. I would have scored like the 99th percentile on the grit test for sure at that point. And I didn't do any of those things. And now, I'm in my late 30s and I have no idea what I'm going to be when I grow up. And so I've sort of taken to even not trying to plan it as much. One of the phrases in the book that stuck the most in my head, and that sounds funny, I'm saying like a phrase from my own book stuck in my head, but it's because someone else said it that I was interviewing, this woman named Herminia Ibarra, who studies how people change careers, basically. And what she said is, we learn who we are in practice, not in theory. And I keep that in my head so much because there's this sort of cultural idea that we can introspect our way to our vocation or our dream work or whatever it is. You take this personality quiz, it'll tell you who you are, and then you just pursue that. But that's totally antithetical to what we know about how personality changes over time and with experience, which is that in fact people do stuff, learn about themselves, reflect on it, and they change course if they're approaching it smartly. And so that's how everything has sort of been for me. Like I've been, I ended up as a subject in one of the studies where I was interviewing the researchers called the Dark Horse Project. That's about how people find fulfilling work. And when I asked one of the researchers what's like, if you could give one phrase that I hate it because when people ask me that, I never know what to say, but like, if you could give one phrase that sums up the takeaway, what do all these people practice? Like, what are their habits of mind that help them find this really unique work where they alone kind of tend to succeed? And what he said was short-term planning, meaning that instead of saying like, following the high school graduation speech of see where you want to be in 10 or 20 years and then decide the steps to get there, they say, what are my options right now? What do I want to learn right now about myself, or what do I want to get better at? And what's the best option for that right now? And maybe in a year, I'll totally change. And then they do that over and over and over and over. They iterate until they get to a spot where they alone can, optimize their performance based on their abilities and their interests. And so I think that idea of learning who you are in practice by trying things, because your conception of your own interests and abilities is limited by your roster of experiences necessarily. And the evidence suggests that we are not so good at just introspecting into what we will be good at and what we will like before we have tried something. And so that's why I sort of wanted to engage with that idea that aspect of grit that praises not having changing interests, because it doesn't seem to, when you look at the larger world outside of like a very specific task, it doesn't seem to be the way that people who find a path to unique work really operate. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I'm pretty passionate about that idea. And again, when you ask me where the impetus for the book came from, some of it, like probably anybody who writes a book, is wondering about your own life and how you got to where you are. And that was definitely true for me in this book.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, it goes back to the Martian tennis analogy. One of my professional interests now is, learning like how to scale my practice and grow as a business. And I've read some of these business books, and like every single one of them talks about your short and your long-term goals and having a business plan and where you want to be in 10 years. And like, I come from the military, so I appreciate planning and the importance of it. But at the same time, like, since I am playing Martian tennis, I would like to believe that in 10 years, I'm going to be asking better questions than I am right now and have a better vision. So in some ways, if I do that 10-year plan based on where I'm at right now in my career, I would be constraining myself. So it's like, I'm not saying that goal planning isn't important, but at the same time, I think some of this stuff, like you said, you just kind of learn organically when you immerse yourself in the environment. You can't always reverse engineer business success or life success or career paths, even though it's a narrative that's very, very soothing, right? Because it's like, oh, if we just follow this algorithm, we're going to go from point A to point B in this very predictable and linear path. And I think that if we're like honest with ourselves, that's not how life works out. And that's actually what makes life fun. I mean, if our lives were scripted, then it would be pretty boring. But I think the greater point here is that any characteristic or quality, if taken to the extreme, can be bad. And this works on a micro level, with individuals, and a macro or organizational level as well. So you talk about how specialized disciplines can become echo chambers that speak in a language that only like-minded people or fellow specialists can understand, and how this can sort of hinder action in times of crisis. So you talk about NASA, the NASA Challenger disaster, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill. What did those things teach you about how organizations can ask better questions and really play Martian tennis, if you will?
Yeah, I think the Challenger disaster, and it's actually really interesting to read the investigation reports of Challenger and then Columbia, the two major accidents, because they were so eerily similar in some of their sort of organizational failures. Whereas NASA, I love NASA. I mean, I minor in astronomy. I'm a huge space buff, and I think what NASA's record has been, given how difficult the tasks they're taking on, have been amazing. But when they have had disasters, there's been sort of a theme to it, which is that they adhere to certain familiar procedures, even when there's information available that's useful to them, but is not coming in through the standard pipelines and procedures, right? So they have these very, very rigid sets of procedures, and that work really, really well most of the time. But then occasionally they don't, like with the Challenger disaster, where there was no dispositive data about the effect temperature would have on O-rings, but there were engineering hunches and there were photographs. There was qualitative data, right? There was an engineer who said, hey, I took these photographs and I think we're going to be in trouble if we launch at a cooler temperature. And he was over and over and over and over asked to quantify it. If you can't quantify it, then it's not an engineering argument. And therefore it was like trying to introduce evidence into court that's disallowed because it didn't comport with the normal information gathering process. And I think one of the things NASA eventually learned, in fact, in the Columbia disaster, when engineers tried to get information from outside of the normal pipeline, NASA ended up sort of apologizing to some outside parties that engineers had tried to go outside the normal process and get more information. And I think one of the things that they learned as an organization was you have to have an informal aspect to your information gathering. Like your processes can be wonderful and your known procedures and really, really important. But if they're so rigid that you're only willing to get information from your known procedures, then you're really limiting the amount of information you can have. And so in addition to that sort of formal pipeline of information, you need to diversify it by also having a strong informal culture where people are allowed to bring up things that don't meet the normal standards of a quantitative engineering argument. And the way I think that's related to the Exxon Valdez spill, like you mentioned, I mean, the way I write about the Exxon Valdez spill is with an eye toward the people who are trying to remediate some of the environmental damage that's still around. They were the experts in remediation, couldn't figure out how to basically skim oil off of water when it got really cold in an efficient way, because it sort of turns into basically like peanut butter in their barges, and it's really hard to pump out. And so eventually they posted online asking if anyone had any ideas. And some guy with like no related expertise whatsoever, in 2 pages, gave them the answer. And so I think they were used to turning inward, like NASA was, to their sort of familiar procedures and familiar faces for getting information to solve problems, and were astute enough to realize, hey, maybe we should try looking outward and see if someone else has relevant knowledge or ideas from some other domain. And it turned out that instantly that was the case, basically.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things for large organizations to do, is to decentralize command, so to speak, and allow for more bottom-up or more horizontal type leadership structures compared to a top-down. And there's certainly instances where a top-down is a superior model, but having that, your book is called Range, and it's allowing for these range of leadership models, and allowing people to sort of divert from what the organizational culture is, having some of that flexibility or bandwidth, so that when people or organizations are encountering these unfamiliar problems, you can generate novel and innovative solutions. So another story that you talk about to sort of exemplify some of these things is an instance with a pararescue team. And I've got to give you props for talking about PJs, having been one back in the day, because we don't get a lot of PR or press. But
I know. What's the deal? Like, the SEALs are in the news like every day, and I wonder if I've been curious about if there's any background chatter about that. They get so much press in pararescue, not so much.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like going back to the dichotomy of some of these qualities, like, every special operations unit has this quiet professional mantra, which is good, but at the same time, like, if you're trying to improve recruitment, you can't be too quiet a professional, or no one's going to know who you are and what you do. But I'll summarize that story a little bit, because I want you to kind of speak to the greater theme. So you talk about an incident, I think it was in Afghanistan, where a pararescue unit, pararescue is basically a group in the military where they respond to mass casualty incidents, aircraft crashes, basically instances where maybe like vehicles or aircraft get shot down, or vehicles get hit with improvised explosives devices, and someone has to go and extricate the patients from the crash site or the blast site, and then medically treat these survivors and get them to a higher level of care. So there was an incident in Afghanistan where I think it was a vehicle or an aircraft crashed or was blown up, and basically there were a bunch of survivors that needed to be extricated and treated. And with a lot of these missions, there are space limitations on the helicopters. So the helicopters can only fly so far and so long, and the more weight in the helicopter, the less long and far they can fly. So the officer in charge of the team on this particular mission was faced with a dilemma. Basically, in order to fit more survivors on the helicopter and create more room, he had to decide who was going to stay on the mission and who was going to get off. And this officer took himself off the mission, because a lot of most of the officers in pararescue don't have the same amount of medical training as the enlisted personnel. So there's basically 2 ways to look at this. You can look at it as, wow, like most people who are in these kind of jobs in the military, they want to go on the missions. They're not looking to get out of things. So you can look at it from the standpoint, wow, this guy is so unselfish that he's willing to take himself off the mission for the betterment of the survivors and of his team. Or you can look at it as, wow, this guy's like afraid and he's trying to get off the mission. My default in that situation would always be the former, where I would give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he's actually a guy who is really itching to go on the mission, but he recognizes that maybe that space is better utilized by putting another a higher trained medical provider on there, or just allowing more survivors so that the helicopters can go back and forth less times to the crash site. So ultimately, this officer in charge decides to take himself off the mission, and there was a huge backlash from his teammates. They ultimately went on the mission, but even for months afterwards, some of his teammates questioned his courage, and I think ultimately the mission was a success, and people came around to the idea that maybe that was the right decision. But I think what this story speaks to is that in some situations, there's really no way to evaluate what's the right or the wrong decision because so many variables influence outcomes. So even if this mission had gone in a totally different direction, and if it wasn't deemed as a success, you could still theoretically say that this officer in charge made the right decision by taking himself off the mission. And conversely, if he'd kept himself on the mission and the mission was had a successful outcome, he might have made the wrong decision. So in these complex, dynamic, wicked environments, like, is there even any way to, how do we really gauge if we made the right decision, right? Because there's so many things that influence these outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great points in what you just said there, and just to go backward, like as a layman, these things about like space limitations and fuel limitations, like this stuff was just like not in my mind. All the incredible number of things you have to balance, just as someone who didn't know how this works, So one of the reasons I found this story so compelling was it's like it was so different, and in this case. Captain Lesmus, who I was interviewing, he made it clear. He's like, you're used to seeing the Hollywood movies where someone gets all this great drone imagery and, everyone can just have like a clear conversation about it. And that was totally not the case here. Like there were a lot of unknowns. How many people are injured, what their status is, how much space is needed, all these things. And so it's this incredibly complex situation. And when you mentioned there was a backlash when he made his decision not to go with the team, like he's a very stoic guy. And partway through the interview, when he started talking about that, I mean, he broke down in tears, like while we were talking. So the amount of heft I think he felt with his decision is just immense. And how do you know if it's a good decision? He was quick to point out, like, I can't say for sure if I made the right decision. It went well, but how do you ever say? Because these situations are so novel. Right? There's no perfect rubric. Like these are the real Martian tennis situations. You will really never know if you made a perfect decision. So what's the best way that you can approach these things? And I think this was in a part of the book where I'm talking a little bit more about structures and organizations and how they develop more range as opposed to just individuals. And in this case, I think it's related to what we were just talking about with the challenger, which is how do you get an individual in a situation like that who's facing Martian tennis to balance their familiar procedures that are in place for a reason with their own thinking, with their own analysis of the situation and their own feeling of accountability to the outcome that's separate from just following procedures, right? Because I go through this research in the book that shows you can use either process or outcome accountability, right? And these are lots of organizations use one or the other, where you either make people accountable for following very well-known procedures or accountable for just what their outcome is, and you don't care how they get there. And it turns out that if you want people to learn how to improve their decision making on the job, you actually want a mix of those things, where there are standard procedures in place that have some value, but that they never feel so beholden to them that they're not willing to deviate when it makes sense. And sort of the ironic thing is that actually people often feel less certain and less good in those situations when they have these competing interests between following procedures and sort of going outside that and recognizing a novel situation, but they learn to make better decisions. So they actively learn even though they might not feel as good about it. And so I think this was sort of a perfect encapsulation of that, where you had this incredibly strong procedures in place, this incredibly strong formal culture of everyone goes together. Right, so much so that there was backlash as soon as Captain Lesmus said he might not go. So because togetherness was such a basic, fundamental part of the normal process, and yet he felt so accountable to the outcome that he was willing, under a lot of pressure, to deviate and do what he thought was best. And so I think while we never know what the perfect decision is, right, and I think in general in everything, people are a lot more sure of that decisions are good or bad than we can ever really know, right? Like you think about something that's incredibly well defined, like blackjack, right? I think the house advantage in blackjack is like 0.5%, which means if you play the game perfectly, because you can play perfectly in a casino, for every $1,000 you bet, you should still have 995 of those. The house should get 5 of your $1,000. And if you are an average player and play kind of poorly, then the house should get like 20 of your dollars, right? So the difference between playing perfectly and playing like an average person is like $15 out of 1,000. And that's in something that's really well defined, where you can say the person who had perfect decision making did just a little bit better over a large number of chances. And so I think in these situations like in pararescue, it's how do you balance the pressure to conform to what you've seen before with forces that will lead someone to deviate when they're faced with an unsure situation, and hope that they learn through that decision-making process. And I think in this case, pararescue clearly, I think, at least in that example, was a good model for balancing pressure to conform to standard procedures and pressure to feel accountable for the outcome that might make you deviate. So that's the real question. I think it's fundamental to most decision-making is, if it's not a card game where there is a perfect way to make decisions, then how do you balance the risk of excessive conformity, like mindless conformity, with the risk of over deviation from good procedures? And so that's the lesson that I was sort of hoping to embed in that story, that when you're facing these incredibly uncertain situations, the best you can do is diversify the pressures that the decision maker feels.
Yeah, and one thing I should have emphasized even more that you spoke to a little bit was the organizational culture in pararescue is one that really emphasizes team integrity, so you try not to break up the team. And another cultural mantra in the military as a whole is that officers should lead from the front, right? So here's a situation where this captain basically is taking himself off the mission. So what happens if he's sitting in a command center and that helicopter gets shot down? He has to live with that. So and obviously if that had happened, there would have been a huge backlash from the unit, from the community, from the military as a whole, maybe even the public. And even if that helicopter had been shot down, he potentially still could have made the right decision.
Right.
Because if he was on the helicopter, he could have gotten shot down too, right? So it's how do we evaluate performance in these highly constrained environments where there's also incomplete information, because we're not operating in a theoretical vacuum. And I think it's a timeless discussion, and that leads to some of the appeal of things like artificial intelligence and big data. And I really enjoyed your analysis of artificial intelligence in the book, because I thought it was a little bit more nuanced than the panacea versus boogeyman narrative that tends to pervade the topic. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between tactics and strategy, and where you think that artificial intelligence is most appropriately utilized?
Sure. In tactics and strategy, the place I first get into that discussion in the book is via chess. Of course, probably the single most famous domain, I would say, for artificial intelligence, at least as far as kind of the casual reader is probably concerned. Sort of everyone knows that Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess, and that was sort of this seminal moment. And tactics in chess refer to basically small combinations of moves that give a local advantage on the board, an immediate advantage. Whereas strategy is the zoomed out view of how do you organize and plan all these little battles, all these little tactical battles to try to execute your larger strategy and win the war, basically. So that's a much more zoomed out approach to playing. Whereas tactics is like, what's the right move to make when you see this pattern of pieces in this area of the board? And what Kasparov sort of noticed when he lost to Deep Blue was superior to him on tactics, which is basically pattern recognition, based on pattern recognition from years of study, but not as good on strategy. And so he helped set up eventually what were called freestyle chess tournaments, where the competitors can play using the assistance of computers. So they can play using against supercomputers, against grandmasters using supercomputers, whatever. People can enter using whatever they want. And the winners of this tournament were a couple of amateur players with some laptops. And so it was a big surprise that they beat the best computers, they beat the best chess players, and they beat the best chess players using the best computers, which was a real surprise, I think, even to Kasparov. And what he determined is that they had, some knowledge of search algorithms and computers and some knowledge of chess, and they were the best at coaching multiple computers to help them what moves to look more into, because even the chess computers can't calculate all the possible positions. It's like not even close to possible. There's like more possible chess games than atoms in the universe. and it's not close. And so they were good at coaching the machines and then taking the feedback the machines got and deciding which one to kind of follow. And these human computer chess combinations are called centaurs. And so I think it sort of serves as a beautiful model for what AI is really best positioned to do, which is to allow us to outsource the kind of pattern recognition stuff, the stuff that's based on these repetitive patterns that chess grandmasters have to study for many, many, many years to learn, right? Like Garry Kasparov did. As soon as he went to freestyle chess, people that he had just annihilated in normal chess could beat him in freestyle chess. So all those years of pattern study were obviated because they could be outsourced to the computer, which was better at it anyway. And then the focus was on this bigger picture strategy. And as we see in gaming AI, the more strategy, the more big picture coordination of lots of different tasks that have to go on, like in battle games where you have to do like lots of like spying and building and you know all these many levels of decision making. The more important strategy is, as opposed to tactics, which is sort of like the combat on the ground. The better humans do, and the more humans have to add to the machines, and the harder it is for machines to compete. And that's just in games. And so then you get outside of games into more open environments. Like I think of the spectrum like this. AI has made exponential progress in chess and totally like annihilated it now. You know, machine learning where you only have to give the rules of chess. You don't even have to, you know, and then just let the computer learn by itself is beaten the best chess players. In a less constrained environment where there's some more uncertainty and the patterns repeat a lot, but not quite as similarly, self-driving cars, there's been huge progress, but there's still a ways to go, especially in kind of unfamiliar situations and conditions. And then you go to something like healthcare, like cancer research, where IBM's Watson was also pitched as this kind of panacea. And it failed so spectacularly that when I was talking to some AI researchers, they were worried that it would do reputational damage to the whole field, and we would back out of using the things AI was even good for, right? Because these were much more open questions. As one oncologist told me, the reason Watson wins at Jeopardy and flailed in cancer research is because we know the answers to Jeopardy. And in cancer research, we're still working on the questions. So I think the more open and big world the question gets, the less it's based on repetitive patterns where there's a huge store of available data, the less of a panacea AI really is. That said, I think its best potential is to liberate humans to do what they do best, focus on strategy, right? One of the AI researchers I talked to said, you know, AI winning video games is cool, but what's really cool is the AI that we're starting to make that will allow humans to design better games without having to learn all the intricacies of programming them. Because that's a part that the computer is not so good at. It can do a lot of the programming, but is not so good at creating a new game that's as engaging. And so I think hopefully we sort of use AI for what it's best at and allow that to liberate humans to do what we're best at. And that kind of feeds into, you know, Moravic's paradox, this term that means humans and computers are often have opposite strengths and weaknesses. And so I hope we can recognize that. And that's why I think I fall between the panacea and the boogeyman of AI, because it's good for what it's good for. And we should use those to supplement humans.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting times ahead. So what about what's in store for you? I'm sure the last thing you want to think about after having just completed a book is what you're going to do for your next book or your next project. But I know that the wheels are always turning. So have you thought about what you want to explore next?
No, I honestly have no idea. And I have to say, I left my job at ProPublica last year to finish the book. And you know, I've experienced, just like the Tillman scholars, I've experienced a lot of kind of anxiety over the years when I've left a whole bunch of jobs, and people are always telling me that it's dumb, that I should stay longer and get some more experience before I do. But I've been much more oriented toward like, what skill do I need to improve now? You know, like when I was a staff writer at Sports Illustrated, I left to go be an intern at ProPublica, where I went from being like, you know, go into NFL locker rooms or whatever with my SI press pass to like literally scanning documents for another reporter, but learning a whole bunch of new skills. And so I've always been kind of oriented toward that, but also anxious about how much I'm changing. Like, is there something wrong with me that I don't stay the course? You know, do I not have enough of that part of the grit scale? But the research that went into this book kind of makes me feel a little bit better about not knowing exactly what I'm doing next, because none of the things I've ended up doing that have been important to me were things that I predicted anyway. And I think that's important to recognize in retrospect. And, of course, I started like having a folder where I would save quotes from people like the Christopher Nolan, the director, or Eric Larson, the great writer who wrote Devil in the White City. I would see these remarkably similar quotes that would be to the effect of, between projects, I basically have to force myself to read a lot and talk to people a lot with no explicit purpose of why. And that's how their next project develops. And that's kind of the same for me. And so I think I'm going to jump back into that phase of where I try to just let my mind roam really broadly and see what comes. And I still have anxiety around that, but a little less so after having done this book, I'd say. And realizing that the projects that have been the most fruitful and important to me were never things that I anticipated. And even once the project started, like if I showed you the book proposals for the sports team and for Range, they bear so little resemblance to the ultimate book. It's like kind of, laughable that that's even the process that I go through to get to the book.
Well, much respect to you because you're basically living the book. Even now, after having written the book about Range, you still don't know what your next project is, and you're not taking that linear path. So nothing hypocritical here. Where can people learn more about your work and the book? I know we're doing this weeks out from when we're going to release it, but the book's supposed to be coming out sometime at the end of May, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's coming out it's coming out May 28th, and I'm just building a new website at davidepstein.com that'll have some info about me, and I'll put up, of course, events and things like that. And that's probably a good way to find out. But I think I don't know. I hope people find the book really, really interesting, and hopefully it's more interesting than reading about me. So, but they can find out a little bit about me at davidepstein.com.
All right, cool. Well, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate everything.
It's my pleasure. And I really appreciate how these questions are, I don't think I would take on a book if I thought it was the answers to the questions would come out very clearly. And so I appreciate the way, like, you really chose to engage with some of the most difficult conceptual questions in the book. And that makes it hard for discussion. But also I appreciate that because I think when you're taking on these questions that don't always have perfect answers and trying to, define what you're grappling with, it's sort of like peering over the ledge of human knowledge and trying to gather information from stories, from research, and put it together so we can think about this in a new way, even without perfect answers. And so, there's a part of me that feels deterred, like, well, we don't have perfect answers, maybe I shouldn't write about it. But then the other part of me is like, but these issues are incredibly important to people. And I'm sure, by gathering information from any angle I can at least make the discussion a little more fertile. And so it feels to me like that's kind of what happened for you. So I feel gratified by that. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, most of the conversations I have with the guests here are really satisfying, but I leave as confused as ever. And I think that's kind of the point.
Yeah. I mean, I think, not to plug my own thing, but I think chapter 10 is sort of how people who feel that way end up actually making much better judgment and particularly predictions about the future. They feel a lot more confused about things, but and a lot less confident, but actually may have a lot better judgment. Well,
I think we should end it on confirmation bias for me. That's a good way to end the conversation.
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
All right. Awesome, man. Thanks so much.
Yeah, pleasure.
This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests.